We are now recording. Do all of you know each other? I can't remember if you know. So we should go around. Yeah,
people look vaguely familiar, but
yeah, right. Why don't we do a round of introductions just
Sure.
to be safe? I'm Sue. I'm at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Sailaja, why don't you go?
Okay. Hi, Sailaja. I'm at Pacific Lutheran University, Tacoma, Washington. And so my project is general chemistry and just, active learning ways to teach concepts that students, you want them to retain in organic chemistry and beyond. Just how do you teach them in an active way so students can retain them, those ideas?
Great, thanks. Stephanie.
Hi, Stephanie Leacock, University of Arkansas, Little Rock. And my Palm project deals with also teaching chemistry, but in intro bio.
Okay, and Jamie.
All right, so I'm Jamie. I'm at the SUNY College of Science and Forestry. And my Palm project is actually on research ethics and teaching research ethics using a flipped classroom.
Cool, very cool.
Great. I would be interested in knowing, for the article that Mike chose for us to look at, do any of you use real world examples like this, sort of case studies of things going on right now?
Yeah.
To grab student interest? Tell me more.
Yeah, it's so exciting right now. It's like the best semester to teach biology because you got a CRISPR Nobel Prize out of it. And now you have all these vaccines coming. And I was telling my students have been learning PCR in both my intro and my genetics class, which is like a junior level. And so I've been telling them, like, I've been dreaming about the whole world being able to talk about PCR with me since like 1996. And now everybody says PCR all the time. I know. I'm like, all your friends know what PCR is now. So I think it's been a great semester I haven't covered a lot of other things I'm supposed to get to, but I got a lot of hot topics.
Do you teach majors or non-majors?
This semester, my class is majors. In the spring, I'll also have a section of non-majors.
Okay.
Yeah.
I say with non-majors, you can teach anything. I mean,
yeah.
They're not going to.
And even with my majors, like, I don't really feel like my department really cares what I cover, or like to what detail, right? So it's been very cool.
Yeah, I've been trying, mine's hard because I've been trying to actually stay away from COVID related stuff. And that's only because I know one of my students' mothers died of it this summer. So I'm trying to be and that's actually one of the things I wanted to point out in reading this is that, and the only reason I know is because he's my advisee as well. But I mean, we're in New York and it definitely hit us really, really hard. So I'm trying to not use COVID type examples because I don't want to make him sad or make him uncomfortable or, try to use it insensitively. So with my class, I tend to use a lot of environmental science examples. I teach analytical chemistry right now. So I try to relate things we were doing redox titrations and we talked about iron in water and why iron in water is bad and tastes bad and you don't want it and how you titrate for it and pull up journal articles that use these random titrations that they probably wouldn't have heard of so that they know that it's in the literature, people are actively doing it for things. But yeah, I've really gone back and forth because I haven't done the quality control lecture, which could very easily lend itself to anything related to COVID because we talk about specificity and we talk about sensitivity. And I just really went back and forth about whether I want to substitute out my BPA for COVID and flu. And I just kind of decided that it's probably not a great idea to do this semester. Mm-hmm. Sorry to bring the mood down a little bit, but I mean, it's nothing that I would have necessarily thought about until I had this student in my class and I was like, maybe it's not a super great idea.
Yeah, that could be very tough.
But I mean, I think that's in general like an awareness to have, right? I mean, like I teach cancer biology and right, or cancer genetics in my genetics class, and surely everyone has been affected in some way, right? So you and just in general, things like chromosome abnormalities and miscarriages, like especially because we have a really non-traditional population, like you know, you can have like not that young people can't have struggled, but I feel like the older you are in your life, the more likely you have encountered some crisis, right? And so the fact that we teach a lot of older non-traditional students means like, I feel like there will be someone who has had every possible problem that you could possibly talk about in biology. So I do think it's like a general awareness of
I mean, I think it's
to
an
approach
awareness,
topics sensitively.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those where it's just like so new that, you know, maybe next year I will talk about it, but in terms of like doing it right now, especially as all of our case numbers go up and all the institutions are, you know, shutting down. And again, like New York was just like hit really hard. So I feel like that's only one student out of the 30 that I know of. So there's a really good chance that, you know, it could impact other people. And the last thing I want to do is like make people uncomfortable about talking about it. So possibly next year. And as I said, I just really went back and forth because I think it is a good learning experience to talk about, you know, things that are happening currently in terms of what it is that they're using. But yeah, just because of this one student, I just felt very uncomfortable, essentially making a situation that's very sensitive to him a learning experience for everybody else.
I wonder if you talked to him, you know, to ask whether he would be really upset by hearing or would be interested in knowing what currently could be done.
Well, and I think it's one of those where it's not 100% necessary in my, like I could use it as an example, but I have so many other examples I could be using right now. And to, you know, talk about this paper where they're in like an immunology class, it makes so much more sense. In analytical chemistry, maybe not that much sense. True. Like I understand the bios, or I know the person teaching like epidemiology is talking about it a lot in his class, and it fits into the coursework a lot more than I don't feel like it's very necessary if I'm like worried about sensitivity issues.
I can imagine in Stephanie's cancer biology class, people walk in knowing that they're going to hear about cancer. And if it's something that's so sensitive to them, they might not take the course.
Right.
I have, I mean, kind of inserted the idea, I mean, here and there, but haven't done any activity like this. But, you know, I think last spring when I was teaching general chemistry too, you know, you talk about the Planck's equation, right? And then, you know, how the peak flattens and it shifts to the longer wavelength region. There are more photons. So, I mean, I just asked them, you know, because I think back in spring, it was all about flattening the curve. So I asked them, you know, what does it remind you of? So almost any kind of distribution you take, it's going to be at the longer, I mean, at higher temperatures, it's going to shift to the longer wavelength region, or, you know, more density of, you know, photons in the longer wavelength region, something like that. So, I mean, I just mentioned it here and there. And there was one thing that McGraw-Hill had, they had a small one-page assignment about hand sanitizers versus soap. But I did mention it when I talked about intermolecular forces. But it was, right? And it wasn't related to reading primary literature. And if I was to do an activity, I think I feel a little bit like Jamie sometimes, you know, when I want to bring in any of those case studies, that I'm sensitive to, you know, the student issues or any kind of past experiences that I might be bringing up that may not be pleasant for them.
Since I'm not a chemist, it doesn't come naturally to me. I'm just thinking about things in daily life and the news cycle that does relate to chemistry. And it is different enough from biology that, yeah, I can see it. It certainly would be a stretch in some cases, in many cases.
True.
Yeah, and I mean, like, even in my like spring ethics class, we talked about it a little bit because I talked about how like a lot of times when people are researching, they tend to do it in isolation because they don't want to like share data with other people, and you're competing. And how with the trying to get a vaccine, like all of that went out the window, and all of a sudden you have people like working at all institutions. They don't care about patents, they don't care about grants, like they're working for the greater good. So like that fit a lot more within the topic of like collaboration we were talking about, because usually you think of collaboration as being like not very pleasant depending, and this way it was, I found some articles about people in Oxford working with people in the US, working with people in Asia, and how that would have normally not ever happened for any vaccine other than this instance right now. But so I think it definitely has a place, and yeah, I could totally see it in like bio classes and using it for that reference. But and as I said, for quality control, I absolutely could talk about it in mind, but there are other options for me to do, and they can make the inference if they want, because we'll talk about like false positives and false negatives and specificity, so they can make the reference in terms of these are the words that they normally hear, and now they know what they mean without me having to like not use COVID as an example, rather than I always use like BPA and BPS, that they look very similar, so you overcount, so you have a lot of false positives, and so they'll be able to make that connection if they want to make that connection, but without me kind of shoving additional examples at them, I guess.
Hi, Carlos. How you doing?
Doing okay. Hello. Sorry I'm a little late.
Does everyone know Carlos? Why don't you just tell us where you are, who you are?
I'm Carlos. I'm at North Carolina State University.
Hey, Carlos.
Are you at a science fair?
No, I wish.
Got like a science fair poster board.
No. my attempt to organize myself.
I like it. I like it.
Oh, that's what I need. Organization. We're just discussing, Carlos, whether or not across different fields, using real world examples of COVID-19 really suits whatever is going on in your classroom and the student population and their own personal experiences with COVID and its results. So,
yeah.
So have you had an opportunity to maybe not use COVID-19 specifically, but other real world news events, things like that to teach?
Well, I teach biotechnology classes, and so this fits the and so we did a case study on using BLAST and looking at coronavirus sequences and aligning them. And then in a class I teach on automation and pipetting robots, it was a really kind of serendipitous in a way, but the company that makes one of the robots was working with Zymo to do COVID testing. So I shared that blog post and said, look, you're trying to get RNA out of bacteria, but it's the same process. You're trying to do this quickly. Let's talk about false positives and false negatives and screening. And this is screening. So that, I guess that's an application. And I've been trying to, in discussion forums, I've been trying to have, in the class I'm teaching right now, it's harder because it's more of a general, it's a microbial genomics class. But in the forums I asked in the automation class, okay, can you find an example of how they're using this technology for COVID testing or for screening for compounds that may be effective?
Mm-hmm. Thinking if I still were teaching foundations, I taught the evolution part of that, and we would often look at HIV strains and their relationship to each other and their relationship to other things like simian viruses. So this, I could see that I might take the COVID sequences and talk about whether or not they are evolving. Are they becoming more infectious? What are their what do the sequences look like? Can you trace various strains? Can you tell where one came from? So,
yeah.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
Well, I was just going to say the other current event that's not specifically COVID related that I find really helpful for students to talk about is GMOs. And my most successful discussion board prompt has been asking them, like, what is something you think is GMO, and look it up. And most often they find out, like a girl posted about strawberries, right? Like she thought strawberries were GMO and they're not, right? And so this is an area where it was actually like revealing misconceptions, because I graded so many papers in the spring or test questions where people wrote about GMO chickens. And I was like, y'all, the chickens are not GMO. And so just revealing like how like these current things that you hear are not really the fact. And so like getting them to really look into that is, I think, helpful.
Your Fritos are, though. They contain GMO corn.
Yes. I'll ask them to look up Fritos next. We haven't done that one yet.
Yep.
So one question that I kind of have about this article that I would like your guys' thoughts on are breakout rooms. So I use breakout rooms in my course. And I feel like there's kind of two trains of thoughts, which is some people, like, I don't go into the students' breakout rooms. I give them the opportunity to either somebody come out of the room if they need me or whatnot, but I don't go in. I have college students, I don't have to worry about going in. But I have heard some other people that are like, no, you have to make sure that they're like doing the work and that they're talking and that they're not just leaving. And like, I just kind of wanted to know if you guys do breakout rooms, if you like pop in, or if you just like, I just kind of hang out in the main room by myself and wait for them to come in, and how you guys, because it looks like they also use breakout rooms. So I just kind of wanted to know like your guys' thoughts on how you're utilizing them, if you are.
I can go first.
Yeah.
So I use breakout rooms, and I do pop in just once during that session, and then and then I ask them. Sometimes when I'm there, they ask me questions, and sometimes they don't. I just say, if you have anything, just raise your hand or send me a message. But I do pop in just to hear their conversations. Sometimes they ask me questions, because what I've found, it depends on the class. Some people are very proactive about asking questions when you're like outside the breakout room. Sometimes they don't. And when they don't do that, I feel like just popping in and asking them questions. So
yeah, I break mine into sections. So they only get in their breakout room for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then they all have to join the main room if they have any questions. And then I kind of put them back in their groups to work on another section. And then I bring them back after 10 to 15 minutes. But yeah, I feel like it's just one of those, like, people go back and forth. So any other thoughts on breakout rooms?
I kind of view them as the teams that we would have in our active learning classroom. And if I've assigned students some kind of task for however amount of time, whether it's 5 minutes or half an hour, I would be circulating around the tables anyway. We also, I don't know if other places have this, we have this system where there's a little button they can push at the table that lights up a light. And so I can say, oh, table 9 has a question. I can specifically go over there. But that seems to me, Jamie, like your system of having a student leave the breakout room and find you and go back. The trouble with Zoom is that there's no way to alert someone in the main room that you have a question, right? Because if you put it in chat, it stays within the chat.
There is a way that they can chat me. in the main.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ah,
Yeah,
perfect.
they could summon you to their room that way.
Well, and the thing that I found most interesting is that like none of my students put their videos on, and I'm not going to require it. But anytime I've been invited into a breakout room, they always have their cameras on working with each other. So I think that's another one of my hesitations about just popping in, is that they seem, depending on who ends up in the group, because I don't pre-select them, I just randomly assign them. You know, if they're in a group of all people they're comfortable with, I think they'll put their cameras on. And then they'll feel comfortable for like me. I just know that, you know, not everybody in classes get along. So if you're in a group of somebody you don't like, you probably won't put your camera on. So I feel like kind of invading privacy-ish by just popping in. And it's interesting because my sister teaches high school. So when she does breakout rooms, she does go in because she is concerned more so about like, you know, they're minors. I have to like actually watch them for things, but I was like, I don't know, college students, I don't have to watch them. It's not required. You know, attendance isn't mandatory in my class, but yeah, no, it's just, it's a very weird concept, these breakout room things. But they love them from what I understand. So.
I had another question about breakout rooms. So do you, I mean, firstly, is there a way to keep those, you know, groups the same throughout the semester? And do you all prefer to do it that way or change up the groups just randomly, just let Zoom assign the breakout rooms?
So I let Zoom assign the breakout rooms and they're just random, but they're consistent per day. So like in Zoom, you can assign breakout rooms and then you can just say like, return everybody to their same room and return everybody to their same room. And because I don't require attendance in my class, I'm always a bit concerned that I can make a breakout room in advance and then all of a sudden like only one person. Yeah. Attendance is slightly going down as the semester goes on. Not terribly, but enough that I would rather just randomly assign them. I just know that I have one person who always recommends not to be with another person for like comfort level. And for her, I pretty much said like, if you're not comfortable in your room, just come back out to the main room and I can just assign you to a different one that's not with this person. But that's, yeah, for me, it's just easier to just like randomly assign. I know in Zoom you can pre-assign them, but I haven't even mastered thinking about that skill yet.
I see. There is a way to keep the groups the same for the whole semester.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can pre-assign them and then you just always upload the same like pre-assigned groups if you want to.
We do things like that because we have a long-term project, or a semester-long project, and so they do need to have the same group of people that they're working with. But yeah, I think for most things, the random assignment, for the reasons you mentioned, Jamie, because if several people aren't there and you get very disproportionate sized groups and some are too small to be effective.
I've also really felt, just to add another reason in favor of not going into the rooms, I always feel like I need to be in the main room in case somebody like gets disconnected and needs to reconnect or joins late and like having to, I just feel like if I'm not there in the main room, like I've lost control of myself. So that's one reason. I will add that I have learning assistants for my genetics class. So these are undergrads who are, you know, serving this role. So I have them in my breakout rooms, at least most days. There's not always enough for every room, but most days I have one learning assistant who can do every room. And what is good is they're now telling me, like, now that we're farther in the semester, like they don't feel needed as much. So I think that that's a good thing, right? That at the beginning, it was like they were having to like pull teeth to get participation in the breakout rooms. And now, they're like, well, they did it mostly on their own without me. So I feel like that's gone pretty well. And I hope to add that to my lower division classes next semester.
Yeah, I think with mine, so I created a lot of activities that didn't exist before this. One, because I gained 3 additional lectures that I'm not giving exams in because they're online. And I was like, oh, I'll make those like full day activities so they can like work in groups. And that was in the beginning of this semester. So those I had more questions with because they were brand new questions. The other ones, on the other hand, were modifications of homeworks where we kind of got the language figured out. And most of the time it's like a language, we don't understand what you're asking by this.
Yeah.
So I didn't have as many of those as the semester went on because they've already kind of been vetted in the homeworks from last year. If they didn't understand it, I just changed it. But yeah, like I like the concept of them. It's just like, I'm still like kind of not weirded out, but everything is just very strange with it being online, I guess. So this is my first time really doing the breakout rooms, but if I give them the option between, you know, do you want to work in breakout rooms and work on stuff, or do you want me to lecture? They usually just say like, we want to just work in groups. We don't care if the questions are harder. And I'm like, cool. I mean, it always ends up being their homework anyway. So it's like they're doing their homework in class with people, and maybe that's why, but as long as it's done, I don't care. So
Anything that gets them discussing and thinking out loud can't be a bad thing, I think.
And explaining to each other their reasons.
yeah, and I think that like my class is interesting because the lecture portion is online, but there's a lab that's in person. And the way that the labs are designed is so they are working alone. So even though it's in person, like they're not working in partners, everything is by themselves, 6 feet away from each other. They all have their own reagent hoods. So they don't talk to each other. So even though it's the in-person, it's not the social in-person experience. So at least if we could do like 6 full day breakout room experiences where they can talk to people, because I think that there was just this misconception that all of a sudden all these in-person classes were going to be like highly social and chatty, and like, no, they're designed, at least the labs are kind of designed not to be that. So yeah, I like them, but I'm still trying to figure out like the best-ish practices on them. So I like the fact that the article talked about them a bunch as well. So sorry to like completely divert from the article, but I just always breakout room questions. So
yeah, and on that note, what is a good size for the breakout rooms?
So I usually leave mine between 3 and 4. So it'll actually tell you on Zoom, like you can select how many, and then it'll say like, you will have 4, or you will have 3 to 4, or you will have 4 to 5. So I don't even have to do the math. You know, I just say like approximately how many people, and it spits out, you know, 7 breakout rooms or 8 breakout rooms. And so that's the number that which is pretty much what I would try to keep if we were working in groups anyway, in person.
3 or 4.
And I have multiple majors, so they don't necessarily all know each other either. So I don't want to keep it so that like somebody's voice is not going to get heard. And if I can try to separate some of the chattier people, I do. But usually it's just random. So
3 or 4 gives everyone a chance to be heard. And you could also actually assign roles to them when it's that small a group, so that you don't have someone who decides to zone out or would like to speak up, but is too shy to be able to break in.
Well, what I do with mine, which is interesting, is that it becomes, they work in their groups, and there's usually like 3 or 4 parts that I subdivide into these like 10 or 15-minute chunks. And then there's always an additional part at the end that is their kind of homework. And then they submit everything as a giant homework, because while I was never a huge fan, I guess, of working in groups, when I strongly believe one thing, that, you know, Carlos is really pushing for you to do a calculation this way. And I was like, no, that one's wrong. So this actually gives them the opportunity they can work in their groups, but they don't have to use the group work if they don't think that it's correct in the end. So they don't get points off for Carlos using the wrong equation and being louder than me. So I kind of give them that opportunity too, which is like, you don't have to go with what the group does. Like the group, you chat, you do whatever you can, but like if you don't agree with the group, then remove that from your homework and you can do it your own way, so that they're not like getting docked points for Carlos being really, really loud. Thanks, Carlos.
No, team dynamics.
Well, going back to the paper, instead of picking on Carlos, I'm looking at figure 1, which is an interesting figure. Now, the paper was aimed presumably at getting students to have increased confidence in their scientific literacy skills, and we would hope eventually actually have increased scientific literacy skills. So this doesn't ever get to that end point of knowing whether they actually do understand things better, but it does get at whether they think they understand better. I guess it was reassuring for me that in figure 1, there weren't any lines that went down from previous. Nobody lost confidence in doing this. Some people stayed the same, but if you start out high, you know, sometimes there's no place to go, and high is high. Those of you who have done this, and it sounds like just about everybody has, do you think it does increase your students' confidence? And or does it increase their actual scientific literacy, their ability to analyze data, or analyze graphs? Have any of you actually tried collecting data on that?
I tried to do it for writing, not for reading. And I think that, at least in my class, when I did it for their ability to write, I did find that a lot of people started out high and stayed high. So like my lecture didn't do anything. But I think that there is something to be said for confidence in terms of moving forward, where even if they weren't better at it when they were done, they're not discouraged from doing it, which could make them better. So I do think that there is something to say about just the confidence levels of a lot of them going up, whether or not it actually made a difference at all. Because I think in a lot of science, confidence is a huge problem. So if we can boost their confidence in themselves, that's probably just a feat in itself.
So talking of confidence, when I saw the sample size, it was small, like less than 20. I mean, it actually, I feel good about it, because when I think about, okay, can I implement a project with this class? And then I am always teaching smaller classes, like 24 students. But I mean, you can get meaningful data, although it may not be very large. So it feels a little heartening to me that I can also do this kind of research even if my sample size is small, and get some meaningful data out of it. So this was a confidence booster for me in a way.
Oh, that's good.
I agree. I always struggle with that because of the way we cap sizes of our classes because of the lab space, which is great. But sometimes I'm like, oh, these other studies have lots of numbers and they could really do tables and analysis, and I'm like, but this one has pre and post and has it did exactly that confidence boost thing.
Several years, I can see, Carlos, yours is a very specialized field, like biotechnology. So I'm guessing your class sizes must be small.
They are. So 16, 18, the max.
And what I liked was when I looked at the method, it's very, very practical, ways to set up the assignment that I really liked. And it could be very useful when I have my students look at some organic synthesis paper or something like that, asking very pointed questions. I thought the methods was very useful for that.
Yeah, so this, this is like a strategy that I have done for years in in-person developmental biology courses, right? We read a paper in advance, and we meet in class, and everybody gets into a group, and each group does a figure, right? This is like classic my class. But so this, I think, is great for having a little more structure put on top of it and convert it into something easily done online. And what I can envision it in my own class in the spring is starting out like this, where they're only responsible for one figure, do a couple of papers that way. by the end of the semester, they'll be able to do their same group, but now do a whole paper, right? And so that's what I did when we converted to online in the spring. They did online paper presentations, which would have been in-person presentations, but they converted, and they actually did a really great job. So I think that with additional structure, like they could do even better. I mean, the online presentations I got in the spring were probably better than anything I'd ever gotten in person. So I'm jazzed about this sort of setup.
I was thinking the same thing, that it would have been nice if they could have had, each group do a figure, like, and just kind of switch them around. So like group 1 does figure 1 first week and group 2 does figure 2 the second week. And then, they swap them so they get to do the entire paper, because I think that while this activity is good for just one activity, if it's only done once and not kind of done several times throughout, then that kind of loses how effective it could potentially. And I know we always run out of time to like do all of this stuff too, but yeah, I think that, Stephanie, what you said, which is like do it several times or carry out the same paper through the whole entire thing. I think that would be much more confidence building than just doing one figure in a group once and being confident, which is they should hopefully confidently be able to do like all the figures after like 5 weeks.
The other bit that I was curious about, so I don't 100% understand the graphs in figure 1. Like there's not enough dots for all the people. But so I was looking more at table 1 where they did the calculation, and in the pre-assessment, the average for all of them is like 5 or a little above 5, which is somewhat agree. And I just kind of wonder like how accurate that is. Like if we had given them a more formative assessment, what would our number be, right? Are they overestimating their abilities, or is it because they're in this program they describe and they have maybe had some experience with this that they are more confident? Because I don't think my students pre would be a 5. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
It does, and it's a 200 level class, so I'm assuming that means that they're probably sophomores. So yeah,
Yeah. The sophomores majoring in immunology.
Yeah. So yeah, what group of sophomores, maybe juniors, would have? I mean, I read papers that I still don't understand now, so I would say I would probably give myself like a 5 or a 6 out of 7.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think that maybe giving them a paper to read before, and then have them judge how well they think that they can comprehend it before they get in their groups would have been a much better assessment, and then work in the groups in the activity and then see how much more you understood after you chatted with a bunch of people and like really analyzed it. Although I'm sure if you gave them the paper and told them that they had to understand it, that they would like freak out.
Yeah, then they would,
then
it would go too far down.
Yeah, then you would start with 2s and it would be fine. It would be another question I kind of had with figure 1, and maybe I just don't totally understand. Oh, wait. So for the pre, it looks like one person went a 2 and then it branched off at the bottom, but is that just 2 people that had a 2? And
no, that
and one went
gathers everybody who scored that on the pre-test. And
I wish they would have not made it look like that, because that went.
We don't know if there were 4 people in that group. Did
I know.
Go to each of the post points, or did 1 go to one and 3 go to the other? Yeah, it's not as informative a graph as it could be.
Right.
No, I think that actually, if they would have just left the table, because I spent so much time with the figure, just trying to figure out how they have 5 dots on one side and 6 dots on the other side, but there's 13 people. But no, that makes a lot more sense that they have like a lot of duplicates, which I feel like there was a better way they probably could have represented that to make it less confusing, but I don't know what that would be. So it's not helpful. This
is going to sound terribly critical, but I actually I did feel that this is the kind of article that you could write in a couple of days, and it's just not, it's informative, but it's not the highest quality it could be. It's kind of a note more than a research article.
Yeah.
Well, and I think going back to what Stephanie said, that this is like a very common thing for people to do. So they, and I guess the novelty is that they used COVID, but in reality, they could have done this with any article. So if they were going to do it, they should have tried to focus it a little bit more with like real life events that are happening. Otherwise, it was just they picked a COVID article, and that's why they kind of left out anything related to, you know, their competency in like understanding the media better when they're talking about it, or, you know, reading other articles related to this topic because they understand PCR better or something. I felt like just going back to what Sue said, that the reason that it was published was because it was an article on COVID rather than, you know, I didn't think it was novel enough, I guess, that it just kind of became a hot topic idea activity. If that makes sense.
Well, so I think COVID and this idea that all of us now have to do things we would have easily done in person online. So like giving an instructor who's kind of swamped and trying to transition my whole life into this breakout room that I don't really understand, right? So I think it provides that like an example of a structure that works, right? Mm-hmm. Which is something I feel like we all are needing now. So I think the combination of topic and transition to online, like my job became harder because I could walk into a classroom with very little prep and say like, okay, tell me about the paper you read last night. Right? And now I have to like really think through what class is going to be. And so that, you know, structure for me is helpful to consider.
I think maybe one of the strengths of this is showing how they set up the whole thing from beginning to end, and having the students present to the rest of the class so that the instructor can correct misconceptions as they come up. I think probably all of you are savvy to how to do this well, but there probably are people out there who are, you know, as Stephanie just said, sort of frantically trying to do things online. And maybe even when they were doing it in class, didn't think about that wrapping up part of it to make sure that not only do the students go through the exercise, but do they actually get the correct interpretation of something so that they could present it, because they could have become really confident in a way that was really bad. And confound their peers and give them false information. And so it's the bringing the circle, closing that circle. And to me, that's maybe the most important point of the paper. That, and it's interesting that they didn't make, I don't think they made a comment about whether or not the students all, by and large, did a good job accurately presenting data and reaching reasonable conclusions.
Yeah, so they even say in the discussion, they say, we were unable to assess if this directly improved students' understanding, right? So they're only assessing like their sort of confidence in their understanding, not the actual understanding itself.
So it's all self-reported.
But I do think that's cool. And I have never done that. I mean, I know tons of surveys of science confidence and things like that exist. I just have never done them. And so that's something I would definitely think of doing in the spring, since I sort of follow this pattern anyway in one of my classes. There's no reason to not ask them, right? Those questions. If it's 3 questions.
There's what I think is a very telling couple of sentences in the conclusions. It's not labeled as conclusions, but it's on the last page of text. And they say, you know, it would be interesting to put exam questions on this topic, to look at those. I'm guessing that whoever reviewed this said, you know, did you follow up? Do students actually learn anything from this? And they say, well, that would be interesting to do. We didn't do it. So there, at least is the acknowledgement that they could go that extra step.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it would have been really interesting, and they probably didn't think of it at the time, which is why, if they put an exam question on the figure that was a different topic, but a similar figure, to see if they
Yes.
actually could, I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of like PCR, which is like, you know, interpret the fold changes of whatever, 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 and see if they can do it for like a completely different topic, and whether they can say like, yes, that was a large fold change or a small fold change, or significant or not significant, or, you know, triplicates or duplicate, you know, like if they could really almost take what they've learned from it and right, that's the application part, and apply it to something else that's outside. I think that that would have, I mean, I'm sure they're probably like kicking themselves for not doing that, but I feel like that would have been a really interesting additional assessment.
Considering that this was submitted at the beginning of September, this was probably something they did last spring when everyone was totally scrambling with no notice to put things online.
Yeah.
So I think it was, I don't know if it had been solicited specifically, or whether it was, as several people have now said, it was just timely. It was a way to take current events and fold them in to what people are desperately trying to do.
Well, I know that the Journal of Chem Ed solicited COVID-19 related articles this summer, because I submitted one and got it accepted. And yeah, it was probably not the best quality, because it was everything I had thrown together in the spring. So in that sense, because I see COVID-19 on the top in the left-hand corner, I'm assuming that this is the journal equivalent of that, which is like, we had to scramble and figure something out. You know, maybe it took place instead of a lab, and this was their way to kind of still have the students do something like lab associated. So in that sense, I think it makes a lot of sense, because yeah, I didn't have surveys before and after. I didn't have exams that I could have stuck things after. You know, we're much more prepared now. But in the spring, it was just like going, crash. So.
And I must confess, I didn't look at the supporting information section.
I didn't either.
That's
because I didn't download it originally. I just had the
PDF
that was sent. So maybe we're bad mouthing the authors, and maybe they, well, no, if they'd had more data, they would have included it in the paper. You don't leave vital things like that out.
Yeah, I'm assuming this was just an activity that they did, that somebody was like, oh, this is interesting. You should
totally
put whatever you can out there. And as I said, I know that I put very, very little thought into what happened in the spring. I just know I need some. So.
Maybe the activity went out first and the surveys went out later. A couple of weeks when they started the activity, they didn't intend for doing all these studies on the efficacy of the activity.
Yeah, so that's a good question that is actually unclear to me from the methods. It doesn't clearly state that they took the survey before the activity. It says that asked to rate their perception of their abilities prior to and following. Does that make sense? Was it a single survey and they were just asked to reflect back to their perception before? That's what it sounds like from this.
That's a good catch, Stephanie. I think it's ambiguous, and it could be interpreted that they took one survey.
Right, which I think might then lead you to overestimate your ability at the beginning, right?
Well, it actually even says in there, in the same survey. So yeah.
Where does it say that?
So in data.
Oh, a single survey. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that they probably just, after it was done, was like, oh yeah, we'll judge this and see how well it works. Which again makes sense, because they probably wouldn't have had time to go through and think about it and design it. Or maybe, and I would have been interested to know if they had done something similar to this in prior years, but just didn't do it with COVID. And now that COVID came out, they decided to use that as an example instead. And because everything was, a lot of the education journals were soliciting things related to COVID, they decided to, write it up. But maybe they had plenty of time. It seemed very well organized for everything that was thrown together in the spring. That kind of makes me believe that they had maybe done this before. Or if they had time to do it, good for them. I know I did. I did not have enough time in the spring to get this well constructed together.
Yes. Clearly my 3 children were not at their house.
So Stephanie, I have a question for you then, because you do something similar to this. I'm looking at the results section, and it said, although a majority of the students participated in the discussion and took turns explaining concepts, not all students contributed to the discussion. So how do you overcome that in yours when you do this, in terms of making sure everybody is actually contributing and, I guess, gets the knowledge they should out of it?
So I have a better answer for contributing than getting the knowledge. So in a former time, I would have had them do in-person presentations, and the rule would be each person has to speak. So that usually means that people are on board. In past lab classes where we were together a lot, I would even have them do anonymous peer evaluation kind of surveys, things like that. That I kind of ended up feeling was more work than it was really worth. As an instructor, I can really tell who's engaged and who's not, right? I don't need you to tell me. So for the online, I kind of did it the same way, everybody. So some of them did a Zoom where they recorded and just made sure everybody had a turn. It does allow for flexibility. I had students working and I could say, well, you can do your voiceover, right, on a PowerPoint. And then if you can't be there at the exact same time as your group. So it does allow that asynchronous flexibility. So I will say I pretty much have only required some visible participation, which does not necessarily correlate with knowledge. But the way it would have been done before is we would have done papers as a class and done exactly what they did here, is each group had to do a figure and they would come up to the front.
So my other question is that I used to do something similar to this, and they would essentially have the whole entire class period to look up a topic, and then everybody would get 5 minutes at the end to do just a quick presentation on whatever it is. And a lot of them said that they didn't like that format, that they wanted more time. They didn't think that there was enough time to really spend to do, and I didn't think I was asking them to do something major. But that I guess and we were always in a computer lab, so they were, computers in front of them in person. And I'm just also wondering, it looks like here they also did the same thing, which is they were done during class and then discussed at the end of class. And I guess this is kind of question for the whole group too, which is what are your thoughts on essentially having these done either in person and presented at the end of class, or being more of they work in groups for whatever time they feel comfortable with until they get to the data, rather than having to present something that they might be less comfortable with at the end?
Yeah, so I will say in this paper, they say that the students were able to do this in 30 minutes, and my students are slow. I mean, there is no way my students could get anything close to this in 30 minutes. It takes them 5 minutes to share a group whiteboard. I mean, they are just slow. So I don't know. I will say I had my students do, this is only slightly related, but I think speaks to your thing. They did a genetics project. I assigned genetics projects for the first time last semester or last fall. It was still in person. So there wasn't time for everybody to give their whole presentation. So we did what I called speed dating the last class day. Everybody got 2 minutes to do their thing. they loved it. It was like the best day. So they still had to turn in a complete thing to me,
Mhm.
but having that little individual share time turned out so cool. I mean, it was like my best day.
You probably didn't
So-
have to do anything either, so that makes it great.
I didn't. I just had to set the timer every time.
Yeah.
But they'd been working on it for like 3 weeks, and so they did have that time, and they knew it was coming, and they, could feel prepared. And so this, I don't know how much my students would get done in 30 minutes.
Yeah, that was kind of my concern, was trying to, really critically analyze a figure for undergrads in 30 minutes, depending on what the figure looks like.
Yeah. So I did note that they still had to turn in something after. And so I mean, I feel comfortable enough with my students that I feel like I could say, present to us what you have at the end of 30 minutes, tell us what you still need to get done, and then that's what you'll turn in, right? And maybe they get till the following day or something. Maybe you give them a longer timeline. So I do feel like that's adjustable. Maybe my upper division students, like after you've done it a couple times, maybe they could go faster. But yeah, intro, no way.
Well, and especially, I mean, if this is a 200 level class, not only is it, a lower division course, but I imagine that, but they all started out very confident. So maybe they're all excellent at looking at figures.
It sounds like it's a follow-up course to something they already had, because it talks about this reviewing material that they've seen before.
Mhm.
That
And
was a huge difference.
And for students to like already be majoring in immunology, which is like really specific, I feel like that's a select population, right? Like of students who know the word immunology as a first year to declare that interest, right? Versus like my students are like, I don't know, I might want to be a doctor.
Yeah, I feel like it was just a bit of I don't want to say like stressful experience to do that in a group and then present it and in just a very short amount of time, because they probably had to read the whole entire article too. And it seems like a very short timeline to be able to do it. Was just my thought. So
you could also pre-assign figures. Well, I guess if you're not pre-assigning yours breakout rooms, you might not be able to do that. Never mind.
And I know people who do the pre-assigned, where this group gets the figure and then in class, kind of like flipped, right?
Yeah,
and then
they could know, then they could arrive prepared for what figure they're gonna.
Well, and then they have the time that they need. So if it's a tough figure, that they can spend an hour, 2 hours, whatever they need to be more confident on it. I don't like being put on the spot for things. So I feel like this was definitely putting the students on the spot to be able to do something fairly difficult. But maybe you're right, it is a select group of people. So
yeah, it says that the students were assigned a review article on COVID-19 to read. So they were expected at least to read the review article before coming in. And the fact that it's a review article means that there's not a lot of materials and methods to wade through. It's going to be more summary material. We are at the end of our time. I don't want to cut us off if there's good discussion going, but I realize people might have other things in their lives that they want to do. So thank you.
Thank you, Sue.
Yeah.
Nice to
Thank
chat
you.
with y'all.
I have a quick question. Do you mind hanging on for a second?
Yeah.
So yeah, I was talking with Mindy last night, and because of, I guess, my class being very disrupted in the spring, we're not going to be able to do a lot of the things we said we were going